As a preface to this review, I started playing Final Fantasy back when Final Fantasy 13 released back in 2010, which that released to great critic reviews but mixed audience reviews. Personally, I loved Final Fantasy 13, and that's what threw me into the Final Fantasy lore. Now, since then, I have played every single Final Fantasy that I could get my hands on, even ones that were for the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, remastered to PS3, PS4, and PS5. Mainly Final Fantasy X, X2, Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII, which is the prequel to Final Fantasy VII. I played through Final Fantasy VII Remake twice. First on PS4 Pro, second time it was the Final Fantasy VII Remake Intergrade on PS5. Final Fantasy 15 was what I played right before playing Final Fantasy 16, and from my experience with Final Fantasy 15, which I have a review on here for that, honestly, most of it I absolutely hated. I hated how linear the story was. I hated the direction of it. I hated everything, including a lot of the gameplay. I thought the gameplay was very repetitious, not very difficult at all, especially if you play it on the easiest difficulty where you never die. It's set to have you never die. Even if you're supposed to die, you don't die, you just keep getting rejuvenated. But I appreciated what they did with the real-time strategic combat in Final Fantasy 15. I really appreciate the visuals in Final Fantasy 15, and I only hope that they did that same stuff in the visuals and combat department and implemented them into Final Fantasy 16. Did they? Let's find out. Final Fantasy 16's story is basically a pseudo non-fiction lore back from the history of medieval Europe or whatever it is, and the biggest controversy with Final Fantasy 15 does have to do with the inspiration of Final Fantasy 16's story set within the realm of the history of Europe, with it being no other race of genders and characters in Final Fantasy 16 except white males and white females, which the developers flat out said they did that intentionally to pay homage to the history of Europe. And I understand that entirely. Do I wish that there were more diverse characters in every game? Yeah, everybody would say that. Everybody would agree with that. But the number one thing I love the most is when you're even pseudo-adapting a story or anything, the adaptation needs to be pristine and 100%. So their explanation as far as the controversy goes makes perfect, plausible sense. Now on to the story. Final Fantasy 16's story is basically 3 seasons worth of Game of Thrones. And when I say that, I mean the first 3 seasons of Game of Thrones, when the writers actually gave a flying fuck about the story and the world of Westeros and Game of Thrones. Final Fantasy 16's story is hands down, the story in a video game to be jotted down in history of gaming at all, for having such a mature, complex, and extremely complicated story for gamers finally. The story in Final Fantasy 16, to preface before delving into the story, it was promoted in Square Enix's Final Fantasy 16 trailers as a revenge story where near the beginning you are your little brother's protector, and near the beginning your village gets ransacked by the enemies and they kill everybody, including your younger brother. And this game was promoted as a revenge story where you go out, find out who did it, and kill them. Well, what I can gladly say is that the promotional advertisement for Final Fantasy 16's story gives you only maybe 10% of the actual story. The story in Final Fantasy 16 is so fucking complex, way more convoluted than just a revenge tale. The revenge tale is part of the story, but it's literally like this much of this big of a story. Now, this game revolves around so many characters, the good and the bad, and you do explore and familiarize yourself with every single one of these characters, including the bad characters, which I applaud the writers for this game, Creative Business Unit 3, who also made Final Fantasy XIV Online. I do applaud them for Final Fantasy XVI, never played 14, but 16 is such an intricately detailed, well-written story about the medieval times and revenge and plotting and war. And I loved it because throughout the game, it's about 46 main story chapters. And throughout, not only do you discover the story of you, Clive Rossfield, and your companions, but you also discover the history and the entirety of the world that you live in, the world being Valisthea. And by the end of this game, you care about every single character that dies, stays alive. Now onto the world in the story of Final Fantasy XVI. Valisthea is an extremely lived-in world. Not only do you play as Clive Rossfield and you go about throughout the entire world, but along the way, while you interact with other companions of yours and bad guys, you end up actually getting not only lore and history of these characters, but also the lore and history of the world and things that are happening within the world at the same time. Such as when you're talking to, say, your companion Jill, or even Joshua, your brother, it ends up having an interface that shows you the world and shows you in picturesque detail what they're talking about. And alongside that, for the direction and storytelling, they also have parts where it'll black out and then go into a scene and say meanwhile, or sometime later, and show other characters while you yourself just played the part of the story that you just got done playing. I really enjoyed all parts of that kind of storytelling in this game. Honestly, the story in this game, I enjoy how they wrote it. I enjoy how they directed you through it. I enjoyed just the entire layout of the story of Final Fantasy XVI. Yes, you are going to be thoroughly confused going through this story, whether you pay full attention or not, but that is the point. This is a mature and complex and intricately layered story that is Final Fantasy XVI that revolves around Clive Rossfield and his story, among other characters' stories. Now, I'm trying not to go through many plot spoilers, and I'm trying to be as generic as possible with my review and prefacing of the story layout. If you want the simplest thing I can say without spoiling, play through the fucking story and also pay attention. That's the most simple thing I can say without spoiling shit for this story. Now, the story takes a lot of cues from Game of Thrones. Now, with that being said, you're not really going to be able to predict, honestly, anything in this game's story, even though it does take a lot of cues from Game of Thrones. So if you watch Game of Thrones, you're still not really going to expect many things, if any. Honestly, within the first 4 or 5 missions, I was completely hooked in this game's story because of how many fucking plot twists upon plot twists they had thrown at you throughout the first 5 missions. And not just that, it doesn't even stop there. Throughout the entirety of the story, there are so many complex twists. So many twists even where things will happen that won't be shown, but will be said to you. And that happened. And you're not entirely sure how because you weren't there, but things happen and you have to adjust to it for the sake of the story, and it makes perfect plausible sense because this is a fully lived-in world of Valisthea. This isn't a story where you're just marching along as one character and you're just going through everything that he experiences. This isn't just about Clive Rossfield. Final Fantasy XVI is about the world of Valisthea and the things that happen within Valisthea. Yes, all of the story revolves around Clive Rossfield and his journey, but at the same time, going through his story, you learn about the entire world of Valisthea and who is the king, who is the lord, who is the peasant, all sorts of things. Honestly, the absolute number one best thing I can say about Final Fantasy XVI lies within its story. It is pristine. It is perfect. I have no complaints for it. Now, with that being said, if they were to one-up themselves after Final Fantasy XVI, basically say if they were to make a pseudo-sequel set in the same world of Valisthea, of medieval times and everything, the one thing they could do that I think would greatly reflect and work well with Final Fantasy XVI is give us a Valisthea world with the main story revolving around multiple POVs, just like they did in Game of Thrones, especially in the books. In Final Fantasy XVI, they do that every now and again with the meanwhiles and the sometime laters, where you do experience a lot of other characters that aren't in the same scene as Clive. But honestly, if they were to go back to Valisthea, I really wish that they would implement that kind of storytelling, where it's one mission you play as, say, Clive. The next mission you play as somebody completely different in a whole other part of the world, and then have 3 more characters all scattered in the entire world. Because then they wouldn't have to constantly be showing meanwhiles or sometime layers or even giving you world development scenes or anything. It would literally be a lived-in world that you are experiencing right in the moment. Now, that's not a knock against Final Fantasy XVI's story. Like I said, the story of 16 is perfect, how they did it. I just think if they do this kind of story again in the future, they should implement what they did with 16 and then expand on it in that kind of way. I would love that so much. So yes, the story in Final Fantasy XVI is completely perfect, completely worthy of your time. It took me about 26 hours for 46 main story missions, I believe, including an epilogue. And this game's story just keeps adding on for you. And not just that, it doesn't feel like it's just added on just to be longer. Even the missions where they stumble, where it's you talk to somebody and you have to go from points A to points B to find things and help people and get parts, it still feels perfect and fitting for the story, because it's part of the story where, say, you just got done in a giant ship battle with an enemy, and right after that you have to do those parts where you have to rebuild your ship. It's those kind of things that honestly, yeah, they slow the story down, but for the sake of feeling immersed inside of the world. The number one thing about this game is the sake of the world Valisthea. Does it feel authentic? And honestly, it 100% fucking does. Much like Final Fantasy XV's combat, Final Fantasy XVI implemented basically the exact same kind of real-time strategic combat that was in Final Fantasy XV, which in my review for 15, I hoped that they would stick with in 16. And honestly, they did wonders with this combat. I was kind of annoyed with 15's combat only because mainly the camera went so fucking wonky, and it also started to feel like a button masher every now and again, on top of you just didn't really die unless you had it on the hardest difficulty settings. But in 16, even on story focused easiest difficulty, this is a challenging fucking game. This is an actual strategic combat system for gameplay. I absolutely enjoyed how many powers you ended up achieving throughout the story, and the fact that you were able to implement and practice and use all of them. I loved it. You can't use every single thing all at once, but you're always able to experiment on everything. And even if you don't do side quests, they give you so many options within the main story to be able to keep being diverse with your combat gameplay. And this game was roughly 26 hours just doing main story. And within the 26 hours, I not at all was bored by the combat. The combat is excellent. I loved how even in the story-focused easy difficulty, it was challenging, but not to the point where you didn't want to play anymore. In the sense of, for an example, you still died plenty of times in this game, but they give you plenty of breaks before dying, such as if you didn't press R1 to dodge when you need to, they do slow down the time and give you the R1 prompt within a certain time limit to dodge and be able to counter. If you don't, then you get hit. That, alongside actually dying in this game, they mix extremely well. I loved it. I loved how this works well for both newcomers or just people that are in it for the story, alongside advanced expert gamers. This game has an extremely well done balance for the combat and gameplay. Not just the combat, there are so many side quests and side activities that you can do. The world of Valisthea, even just the main story alone, is very lived in and immersed, but do the side quests and the side activities, and this feels like a fully living world. So the gameplay, I didn't have too much to say about it, but it is a top-notch kind of gameplay. I love the combat, I love the mechanics of it, I love the powers. The one slight thing I have to say about the combat, I'm not entirely sure if this happens on the hardest difficulty as well. I do know on the easier difficulties, the power prompts just kind of automatically kick in whenever the timer is up and you're able to use that power again. They just kind of do them themselves. Like if you're in the lightning part, it'll switch over to the fire and automatically do a power for you, which I wasn't really okay with that because it kind of took away my strategies for being able to play the combat how I wanted to play it. Like if they wanted me to do the flames and everything, then just let me click on it. That's one slight I had against the gameplay, but otherwise, I'm sure there's a setting to turn that off or just put it on the harder difficulties. Otherwise, the gameplay is flawless. The presentation, the visuals, and audio of Final Fantasy XVI are extremely next-gen, current-gen, PS5 worthy. This game did not stutter at all in terms of frame rate. I did not discover any frame rate drops, no hitches or anything. I experienced nothing bad about the audios or visuals of Final Fantasy XVI. And that's really good and excellent to say considering how fucking giant and massive this game's world is. Overall, Final Fantasy XVI is an extremely worthy game to spend your time on. It took me 7 days of kind of constant playing around on the main story to finally finish the main story. And there's so much left to do. And on top of that, the story alone goes through 18 full years of Clive Rossfield's and the world's story. And that's just the main story. 46 main story missions alongside all of the kind of side activities that you're able to discover throughout this game. Plus, all of the abilities and all of the items and all of the weapons that you're able to equip within this game, throughout the game, progressing through the game. All Final Fantasy XVI is extremely worth your time, and it is a pitch fucking perfect game. Final Fantasy XVI for me is a 10 out of 10. Thank you.